Welcome back to this week's episode of Green Enterprise, a partnership between my company, Digital Venture Partners, and Black Enterprise, where every week I have a conversation with a prominent Black cannabis advocate or executive that is making positive progress in the space and, more importantly, creating infrastructure for more Black people to come in and find success. Today with me, I have Congressional candidate Mrs. Cassandra Goodrum, who is running for election in the first Congressional District of Illinois. How you doing today, Cassandra?
I am doing very well. How are you today, Andrew?
I'm doing great. I had the pleasure of being introduced to you a few weeks ago and just did some research around just the beautiful work that you're doing, not only at Chicago State, but locally as a public servant. And we'll get into it, your very interesting take on how Black people can benefit from the legal cannabis space. But before we jump into that, I'd love for you to give our viewers a background of just how you got into public service and law and kind of what led you up to this point to announcing your candidacy.
Well, thank you once again for inviting me to this lovely platform. Just a little myself, I am an attorney here in Chicago. I grew up in this same general area in this first congressional district, but my parents were educators. My mother, 30 years public education. My father was in the Army, 30 years, retired, went into public education, taught ROTC, and growing up, I said, I want to be anything but a teacher. I just want to do something different. And somehow I got drawn to the law, right? So I went to Northwestern Law School. And when I came out, I worked with the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. And at that time, working with the State's Attorney's Office was just an entree. So you get exposed to a lot of things. And right away, you start to see a lot of the inequalities in terms of the systemic racism that is practiced within our criminal justice system. And so I left after about 5 years, went into private practice, did that for 20 years. And of course, during that time, you reach out and you participate in your children's schools and join the local school councils and just try to stay active and keep abreast of things that are going on. And 10 years ago, I was blessed enough to be offered an opportunity to teach at Chicago State University in the criminal justice philosophy and political science department. And of course, God always has a plan, right? And always laughs at us when we have one. So I just love teaching. And it has just been a blessing to be there since for the last 10 years and with the wonderful students that are there. And then part of the reason that I chose to make a run for Congress at this point in time was because of the little shortcomings that I was seeing in my students' education. And they were educated right here in this first congressional district, many of them in the public school system. And here in Chicago, we just recently renamed Lakeshore Drive to John Baptiste Point du Sable Lakeshore Drive. And many of you will probably know John Baptiste Point du Sable was the founder of Chicago, the first settler here, Black man of Haitian descent, trader, and came in and settled this area. So I asked my students, I'm all excited. We just got Lakeshore Drive renamed. Who knows who John Baptiste Point du Sable is? And I was just floored that no one knew who he was. You would think that would be just Black history that you would know about generally, but especially if you're from Chicago, right? So I asked it in 3 different classes too. So it wasn't just the one class, it was across the board. And I had run into this several times in the past. I remember asking a little girl who attended Harold Washington Elementary School who Harold Washington was, and she couldn't tell me. And Harold Washington was, of course, the first Black mayor of Chicago. So with that being said, that was part of the reason that I decided to make this run. And and that brings us to where we are today.
Okay, amazing. And a question that I have that I think should be a topic of discussion for Black people. It seems that the Black electorate turnout only seems to be tied to like presidential races, right? What's the importance of us paying attention to congressional, local, and statewide elections, and how can that benefit Black people if we take a more concerted effort to elect people into roles such as yourself that may not have the national commercial exposure of like a presidential or senatorial or even gubernatorial
Gubernatorial.
Gubernatorial. I knew it was I'm from Alabama, so you got to excuse my accent. But so what's the importance of us paying attention to congressional district elections as Black people?
Okay, may I just encourage us to all pay attention to all elections, especially going forward, and especially in light of the voting rights legislation that we're trying to get through the Congress right now. But specifically, it's important to, first of all, pay attention to how the rest of the world is reacting or acting around us. And after that last person that we allowed to be a president, and after that insurrection on the Capitol, where democracy was literally endangered, I think everyone should take a greater interest in everything that is going on around them political. And I would never have considered myself a politician. Of course, you get into politics and you're interested in what's happening, but I think we should, and this is what I warn my students about as well. You have to pay attention to what the other side is doing. And if you have a third of the voting population in this country believing that an election was stolen, and they have a right to storm our Capitol building, then we need to pay attention, because if they believe it that strongly, we certainly need to believe strong enough that we can act and regain the democracy that we want. So with that being said, though, I also look at in the legislature, which is what the congressmen do, they write legislation. That legislation is also attached to money. So all of the money that the government is going to siphon off and split up and send out to the states is determined right there in Congress. So when you turn around, and right now they have the infrastructure bill, right? So infrastructure is, of course, not just bridges that they're addressing, but bridges and even the internet infrastructure so that everybody can get internet access, streets. You're always worried about your streets and your roads and everything like that. So there are things that are right here in our communities that are being influenced by the decisions that people in Washington, D.C. are making. So it's really important to try and find a candidate that expresses views that are similar to your own, so that you can make sure that your interests are being provided for and represented when you elect an official. So I hope I give you my position on where that goes, but I am really concerned about the lack of interest that a lot of people seem to show in politics. And I really try to encourage it in my students, to the point that I give them extra credit for bringing in their voters registration cards. And if there's actually an election, they get extra credit for showing me that little strip where they actually went out and participated and did their civic duty.
Okay, that's amazing. We're going to get into, the cannabis standpoint that you carry in your election in a second. But this is the first time I've had a conversation with a congressional candidate, so I'm trying to get some free advice on life right now. So another thing that I appreciate about your backstory and your resume is that you've worked in various areas of serving the public, whether that's your role at Chicago State, whether that's as an attorney, and being an attorney for your local. Were you a prosecutor or a defense attorney?
So I started out as a prosecutor. That's the state's attorney's office. So that was prosecution. And that was followed by my private practice, where I concentrated in family law and Social Security disability.
Okay.
So I was interested in helping people to try to get some of the benefits that are available for Social Security. And then, of course, there's that other side where we try to help people find a little peace by, maybe separating from the person that they're chose to be attached to at one time.
No, that's amazing. This leads me precisely to my point. I think recently there's been like this influx of celebrity candidates as it comes to public office, which is nothing wrong with, but I appreciate when someone has to work alongside people, see different parts of the experience that maybe they don't have to deal with, right? I'm sure as an attorney, as a professor, you've had to deal with people from walks of life that you did not have to grow up in their environment. So how does that equip you as a lawmaker or a policymaker to be able to carry those experiences and relationships with you into public office?
That is a fabulous question. And I really have to say that a large part of my feelings on how we can even help people and what some of the real problems are actually came from what I learned from students over the last 10 years. Students who, you know, I was working in an after school program at one time, and, you know, little kids, elementary grade, and the fathers would come and pick them up sometimes to walk them home. And I just noticed this little boy one day, and he was usually kind of jovial. And I'm like, what's wrong? And he said, my dad got locked up last night. Well, no, that's not part of my experience, but here's this child, that's his reality. And it just makes you more sensitive to what's going on. And that story has been reiterated over and over, even at Chicago State, where I am about people who have grown up without fathers, who have been, because the fathers were locked up, or even more importantly, stories of fathers who were locked up and then really made something of themselves and really started contributing to society and didn't fall into those stereotypes that we have for returning citizens. So I mean, I have learned so much and gained so much just by that experience, as you said, of interacting with people who didn't have the same walk of life that I had. And that has just enriched me. So and it makes me even more passionate about some of the things that I see, those injustices, to think that maybe now I can help correct some of those things.
Right, I agree. They say the greatest experience is the human experience, right? Us having to live alongside people who may have differing views or backstories as ourselves. And it makes us more empathetic for what people are dealing with. And it makes it much more difficult to judge what anybody has gone through if you actually had to see someone, whether the cause or the effect of what they've gone through. But I'll give the people what they came for at this point, which is our cannabis discussion,
okay.
right?
All right.
You have a very interesting stance on the plan and what it can do for Black people, particularly in Illinois. Could you give us an idea of your stance on how we can utilize cannabis as Black people to kind of bridge the economic and social gaps professionally?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it is essential that we take into consideration that it is time that we have federal legislation that not only decriminalizes, but also deschedules cannabis. Okay, so that's one of the teeth of my platform as we go forward. So you might ask why we need this legislation, but of course we need it because communities of color have so often been disenfranchised by the laws that are in our criminal justice system as they refer to drug use or drug possession. And even today, where 18 states plus the District of Columbia have legalized cannabis, there are still more people of color who are being arrested on cannabis offenses and locked up. So, of course, now it's my opinion and my stance that we should decriminalize cannabis and not only strike down all those mandatory sentences that have been associated with it that have mass incarceration, but we also want to now release all of the people who have been adversely impacted by cannabis and may be locked up at the time because of cannabis offenses. So that's one part of it. And then we have to understand that the cannabis industry is just blowing up right now, right? Even though it's not legal at a federal level, it's already blowing up. But if we were to legalize or decriminalize cannabis at this time, I would see it as an economic engine, as a part of the Green New Deal that everyone's talking about with solar energy and all of that stuff. We can use the cannabis to revitalize our communities and have hydroponic grow houses. I even saw an article where they were growing crops under solar panels. So can you see growing cannabis under that solar panel? And then in addition to that, the revenues from cannabis could fund education so that we can now train these people so that they can participate in this Green New Deal and learn how to build wind turbines and install solar panels, grow in these hydroponic grow houses. And of course, make sure that the education is comprehensive so that we don't have those lapses that I've been noticing in my students as we go forward. So Andrew, I guess what I'm looking at is we want to create pathways to prosperity, pathways to peace, and not pathways to prison that we just keep hearing about.
Right, and I have two follow-up questions to that.
Sure.
So we often, as lower and middle class people, where a vast majority of Black people fall in America, right, into one of those two categories, we assume as far as like legislation and public policy that someone else will take care of it, or the best case scenario will just inevitably happen because that's what's supposed to happen. And we don't talk about what can happen if we ignore an issue or if we don't act swiftly upon it. What is the worst case scenario as it comes to like cannabis policy, federal legalization, and how it could harm or impede Black people's involvement if we don't figure out a way to really unify and create real change for ourselves in the space?
Andrew, what I see is the trend that is already taking place. Here in Illinois, there are 89 dispensaries and none of them are Black owned. Nationwide, 90 to 95% of the legal dispensaries are owned by white men. So what does that show us? It's how America has treated us all along, right? We are not getting an equitable share of this cannabis industry. So why now, where we have this cash crop of cannabis, are people of color being excluded yet again? So that's a worst case scenario, right? But my solution for that worst case scenario is that I believe that descendants of chattel slaves should be given an equitable share of the cannabis industry across the board once it's legalized. And that should be a part of reparations. So, what better way to give us reparations after we have used our blood, sweat, and tears of our ancestors to build this country than to give us an equitable share of that particular industry, this particular industry, as it currently sits, and as going forward, we go ahead and decriminalize it and deschedule it and put this industry on its feet, just as we did for alcohol. You know, alcohol wasn't always legal. So we have a way of looking at how we can decriminalize it and make a way for us to now be a part of it and make sure that people of color and descendants of chattel slaves are getting our equitable share of any revenue that's made off of this industry.
Agreed 100%. And it's a scary fact that over the past few years, diversity and ownership amongst Black people, women, brown people has actually decreased in cannabis. As more states have come on board, as more markets have legalized, there are actually less representation in the boardroom and on the cap table for Black people. So, but I want to transition a little bit into, what your school is doing, Chicago State. I'm from Alabama. And Alabama just recently approved a medical program, right? But Black people down here aren't taking it seriously because they've never seen a cannabis economy built out. They've never been into a dispensary. They've never seen a cultivation center, right? And rightly so, we have this negative connotation attached with cannabis because we've seen so many of our family members and friends locked up because of it. But the thing that I love about Chicago State is you guys are very progressive on educating your student body and alumni around the opportunities in the space and how they should reform their thought process to separate cannabis from the cannabis industry, right? It is an industry. So what's been some of the benefits of your institution taking a real concerted effort to educate the local population on what cannabis is going to become?
Well, first of all, I think education is a way to learn how to dream bigger. Okay, so that's the main thing we have to look at here. When I started teaching, I always begin the first day of class and I ask students, what do you want to be or what do you want to do with this degree once you've actually achieved it, right? And the answer inevitably in criminal justice was, I want to be a probation officer. That's the experience of many of our students. That's what they've been exposed to, is that side of the criminal justice arena. but now that you're bringing in this cannabis industry and that we're able to educate our students on this industry and how we can look at it as a business, and more importantly, how we can look at it as an economic growth vehicle for our communities to improve them and make them better. I think everybody can dream a little bigger and see a bigger picture of what it could be. And not only what it could be, but how we can get there. So we're creating that pathway once again to prosperity, and that pathway to prosperity leads to a pathway to peace as well.
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of that stance, and I'm excited to just, be a fly on the wall and really engage with you and your faculty at Chicago State as we discuss like more initiatives that we can do for Black people in cannabis. But I want to revert back to your campaign. Like where do you stand now? I know you just recently announced your candidacy. For people who want to support or get an idea of how do you support a candidate such as yourself, like how does that look for like a viewer or a constituent to support your campaign?
Thank you so much for that opportunity, Andrew. The way to support any campaign, but especially is, of course, just as you did, Andrew, you went and looked into who I was and what I've been doing all along. You also have to do one little thing, and that's perhaps sign a petition that allows us to get on the ballot in the first place. That is critical. And then most importantly, understand that politics is all about money, unfortunately, especially the electoral process. And it's estimated that it takes anywhere from between $2 million to $500,000 to actually run a successful congressional campaign. And you already know where I work. I work at Chicago State. It's the state university. So my salary is listed for the public to see. This is not a campaign that will be financed entirely by Cassandra Goodrum, attorney. So you can show your support, and it's really important that you support the candidate that expresses your views, as I indicated previously. But you can support my candidacy by going to Goodrum for Congress, and it's Goodrum, Goodrum, with the number 4, Congress, at gmail.com. And that will, you can use that as a Zelle link, or you can send information to our campaign offices so that we can help you make a contribution in any other way. So of course, we're also looking to build staff at this time. You have to get literature out. You have to do all of these things that cost money. And of course, we need to go ahead and make a way for this candidacy to be not just viable, but to win, because that's what we're out here for, so that I can have the opportunity to serve this first congressional district.
Right, and we definitely encourage urgency, but just as an idea of like a timeline, how long do viewers have or supporters have to actually sign your petition to help you get onto the ballot?
Okay. Well, thank you. You will see people walking around here in Chicago, in Illinois, doing petitions up until the end of February, essentially. So it's the coldest months of the year. Right here in Chicago, it's below 0 out here today, and we have to go out and collect signatures to get on the ballot. And once again, this is how politics works. They're not trying to make it easy for anyone, but we need to get our signatures by the end of February. And from February to June 28th is when they can challenge any signatures that are on there, and challenges basically will determine who will actually end up on the ballot as a candidate. And then the primary will be June 28th of this year, 2022, June 28th. So that first part, if you see people out just for signatures, cooperate, if you will, and that's not just for me, but that's all candidates, because there are other elected positions that impact us that are of course going to be in this primary election.
So it's definitely an arduous process, and I want to congratulate you first and foremost on the work that you've done, not only as a congressional candidate, but just as a citizen, right? As a person who is part of the fabric of Chicago, and you definitely contributed to Black people around you at every step of the way. So you're definitely deserving of this opportunity, and I am genuinely hopeful and confident that you will win. and that you will make positive
Thank you.
change, and it's interesting because when I meet people like you, I feel like, you don't need the structure needs you, right? So I'm very excited for you. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing all the success that you will have in 2022. And if you have anything that you would like to leave our viewers with, maybe where they can reach out to you personally if they have any questions, or if they want to try to help volunteer.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you once again for this opportunity, Andrew. I am looking forward to seeing cannabis take off, but being a vehicle that will greatly positively impact our communities. And that's across the board, not just here in Illinois. If you want to reach out to me, the number that you can use is 773-520-2709. And of course, I can put you through to whatever needs to be done to help me win this election. And I am so looking forward to coming back as the first Black woman to represent the 1st Congressional District of Illinois, and see what we can do to make sure that we can get this legislation through and pass the decriminalization of cannabis going forward.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. I definitely look forward to your success.
Thank you. Thank you again, Andrew.